I think that the contrast between Jesus and Peter in our passage here at the end of Mark 14 is fascinating. In different ways, both of them, in a sense, are put on trial. And the way they respond to that trial is very, very different. You could say, I think, that their stories are case studies in what it means to count the cost of discipleship and whether or not we will take up our cross. Now, as I use this language of taking up our cross, I actually want you to try to remember back to the beginning of that section in the book of Mark that we call the way section, where Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. From Mark 8 leading up to Mark 11, Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem. He's heading towards the cross. And in Mark 8, he calls the crowd to him along with his disciples and says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels." I think it's interesting that all the way back in Mark chapter 8, Jesus knew what he was going to face in Jerusalem. He knew that he was going to be attacked by the religious leaders and probably the Romans. He knew that a cross was likely in his future. And yet, as we look at this passage in Mark 14, in light of what Jesus said in Mark 8, there's a big difference between how Jesus and Peter sort of internalized this idea as they were headed towards their adversity. In the midst of each of their different trials, Jesus steadfastly goes to his cross, while Peter is so desperate to save his own life that he nearly forfeits his soul. Now, as I speak about Peter in this way, I want to be clear. I'm not trying to be negative about him. I'm just trying to describe what happened to him because I see myself in his story. I don't know exactly what it would be like to be in his situation. And I want to give Peter a lot of credit that Peter actually seemed to be willing to die for Jesus in the garden. When the Roman soldiers showed up to arrest Jesus, Mark doesn't tell us who pulled out the sword and cut off the servant's ear. But in the Gospel of John, we learn that it was actually Peter. Isn't it intriguing that in the same chapter, really in back to back stories, Peter was willing to fight for Jesus and die, and then he turned around and he wouldn't even admit that he knew Jesus. He was so afraid that he wouldn't even acknowledge that he had anything to do with him. I think Peter's example is a good reminder of three things that are true of us. First, we don't know exactly what's going on in our hearts. The truth is, we are all mixed bags. There's good and bad in there, courage and fear. Second, there's a lot of power in peer pressure, both positively and negatively. Look how different Peter was when he was with his fellow disciples in the garden when the Roman soldiers showed up. He's like, let's fight. But when he's by himself, uh, outside where this trial is taking place, I mean, he's clearly afraid. And that kind of leads into the third and final point I want to make, which is that sometimes it's easier to die for Jesus than it is to live for Jesus. And what I mean by that is Peter was willing to die at the hands of the Roman soldiers in the garden. These guys were trained killers, but he's terrified and afraid when he's confronted by some servant girls, some kind of random servant girls in the courtyard of the high priest. It does not make sense. And yet, in my own experience, it is often easier for us to make big, decisive changes in our lives. Like, I'm going to move, I'm going to quit that job, I'm going to, break off this relationship, than it is to make lots of ongoing little decisions. Like, I'm going to keep telling the truth in this situation. I'm going to keep loving even when I'm, in a situation where I'm receiving evil. I'm going to keep returning with good. It can be difficult to live for Jesus. This is what I think Paul was talking about in Romans 12:1 when he said we should offer our bodies as living sacrifices. But I've heard lots of pastors say that the problem with a living sacrifice is that the sacrifice keeps crawling off the altar. I've definitely done some of that kind of crawling in my own life, and I think that's what happened to Peter as well. Now, as I go today, I want to challenge you to commit throughout the next few days to just pray that God will help you to live for Him in every decision you make. Maybe this weekend, you'll just get out a piece of paper and ask Jesus to show you if there's any area of your life where you've been living as if you were ashamed of Him, or if around certain people your life seems to deny that you even know Jesus. Now, after you do this exercise, ask God to give you the courage that Jesus had at His trial, that you're willing to count the cost and even go to your cross because you're going to live and even die for your Savior. Now, remember, the point of this exercise is not to bring judgment or condemnation in your life, but to make a course correction so that we can learn from Peter's mistakes and ask God for the strength that we need to follow Jesus, even if that means following him all the way to the cross. God bless you guys. Take care.